The concept of Sunnah in the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas by Mohammed Yusuf Guraya. The above evidence points to the fact that the main cause of the Arabs' fury and their violence was that the Prophet, as a single person, was taking the place of their forefathers. By doing so, he, as a single person, challenged the basis of their Sunnah and its normativeness and introduced sweeping innovations. Against this old established Sunnah of the Arabs, the Prophet placed himself and introduced a new Sunnah, which basically revolved around the teaching of the Prophet himself, a single individual. The Sunnah prevalent among the Arabs and the Sunnah introduced by the Prophet were different as far as the moral import and spirit were concerned. As far as the concept of Sunnah is concerned, these two Sunnahs were not different, even though their formal appearance might suggest that they were. There were two main objections of the Arabs against the Sunnah introduced by the Prophet. First, the Sunnah should have an air of antiquity. Second, its authorship should be collective, i.e., authorship should have its origin in the forefathers collectively. Both the conditions they realized were lacking in the Sunnah advocated by the Prophet. The Prophet, on the other hand, rejected both of them, considering them as later accretions to the real concept of Sunnah, setting aside the cumulative tradition he brought to surface what was lying buried underneath the latter accretive material. In the pre-Islamic Arabia, each and every tribe has its own Sunnah distinct from the other, which in turn was given to them by their respective individual leaders. Labid ibn Rabi'a, for instance, is a very emphatic individual in this regard. Praising his tribe, he says in the following poetry, "He comes from a tribe from whom their ancestors have established a normative behavior. Every community has its Sunnah and its originator." Hassan ibn Thabit has also referred to this same fact. It means whatever Sunnah the pre-Islamic Arabs had was at that time of its origin the creation of single individuals, and it was later after time followed by the agents that were left after them, their names having been forgotten. An air of antiquity began to be associated with their actions, and an idea of collective authorship, forefathers, began to be attached to them. It is this perspective that the meaning of the Sunnah becomes clear. The Sunnah, in its original meaning, is the way of acting, that is, a way of acting which was introduced by the former people, which was consequently become a trodden path for those after them. Sunnah is what is established by the initiator in the beginning. When it has become a thoroughfare, it is called a maslak. In this context of meaning of Sunnah, the Prophet in fact was not an innovator, as he was called by his adversaries. Rather, he brought into focus what was already latent in the concept of Sunnah. By vigorous argument, he made the concept operative and effective again, and restored it to its vigor and activity. It was a renewal of validity and a sort of reminder. He vividly and actively discriminated between ideality and practice, and clarified what was confused in the idea of Sunnah. B. The vigorous and effective persuasion of the Arabs by the Prophet bore fruit. The Arabs who accepted Islam began to pattern their life according to the view of this individual, the Prophet, instead of the collective group, the forefathers. The Prophet, as a good exemplar, set examples and tried to divert the direction of life towards his own teachings and exemplary conduct. This ideal of Sunnah began to replace those undesirable elements in the Sunnah prevalent before Islam, and accepted those which fulfilled the normative patterns set by the Prophet. According to Goldziher, in the words of Dr. Fazl Rahman, immediately after the advent of the Prophet, its practice and conduct had come to constitute the Sunnah for a young Muslim community, and the ideality of the pre-Islamic Arab Sunnah had come to cease. Duncan B. MacDonald, writing about the change brought about by the Prophet in the customary laws of the Arab, says the following. The new and dominated element was the personality of Muhammad himself. His contribution was legislation, pure and simple, the only legislation that was ever been in Islam. Till his death, 10 years later, he ruled his community as an absolute monarch, as a prophet in his own right. Professor Shat has maintained, as the Prophet, he became the ruler lawgiver of a new society on a religious basis. The community of Muslims, which was meant to and at once began to supersede Arabian tribal society. The legislation of the Prophet too was an innovation in the law of Arabia. After giving reasons for the Qur'anic legislation, Professor Shak concludes, the prohibition of gambling, associated as this was with pagan worship of drinking wine, constitutes perhaps the clearest break with ancient Arabian standards of behaviour. Besides, it had become necessary to deal with new problems, because of the main political aim of the Prophet, the dissolution of the ancient tribal organisation, and the creation of a community of believers in its stead. Professor Majid Khadouri states, in his compact with the people of Medina in 623, Muhammad defined his Muslim community as an ummah in distinction from the rest of the people, in which all loyalties, tribal or otherwise, were superseded by the Muslim brotherhood. Dr. Fazl Rahman has the following to say, so long as the Prophet was alive, he provided the sole religious and political guide for Muslims through the Qur'anic revelation and by his extra Qur'anic words and behaviors. Dr. Fazl Rahman also says, before the Prophet died, he had created the conditions for universal brotherhood on the basis of faith, a principle which he vigorously substituted for the old blood ties and tribal loyalties of the Arabs. Professor N.J. Coulson has summed up this pre-Islamic usage of the Arabs and the change brought about by the Prophet in the following words. To the tribe as a whole belonged the power to determine the standards by which its members should live. Neither the tribal sheikh nor any representative assembly had legislative power to interfere with their system. Modifications of the law, which naturally occurred with the passage of time, may have been initiated by individuals, but their real source lay in the will of the whole community, for they could not form part of the tribal law unless and until they were generally accepted as such. With the advent of Islam, this pre-Islamic system changed and sweeping innovation was introduced. Obey God and His Prophet is the Qur'anic command, and in it lies the supreme innovation introduced by Islam into the societal structure of Arabia, the establishment of a novel political power possessing legislative power. He further says, the year 622 saw the establishment of the Muslim community in Medina. The Arab tribes or sub-tribes, with some temporary exceptions, accepted Muhammad as the Prophet or spokesman of God, and regarded themselves and his Meccan followers as constituting a group of a new kind, transcending tribal ties. While Muhammad's position gradually developed into one of political and legal sovereignty, the will of God, as transmitted to the community by him in the Qur'anic revelations, came to supersede tribal custom in various respects. According to Coulson, the most radical reforms of the Arabian customary law affected in the Qur'an were rules on marriage and divorce. In the laws of divorce, the supreme innovation of the Qur'an lies in the introduction of the waiting period. The Qur'anic laws of inheritance, says Coulson, are the best illustrations in this connection. He has explained the pre-Islamic societal structure according to which the rules of inheritance were designed to consolidate the strength of the individual tribe as an effective participant in the popular sport of tribal warfare. Accordingly, in order to keep property within the tribe, rights of inheritance belonged solely to the male agnate relatives, asaba, of the deceased. With the advent of Islam, the societal structure changed. Stay tuned for many more parts.